My husband laughed in my face during the divorce and said, "You're nothing without me. You'll be begging on the streets." I stayed quiet. Then my lawyer handed the judge a folder with my offshore account statements. My husband's face went from smug to white in seconds, and the judge said something that made him collapse. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from which part of the world you are watching, get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. His lawyer asked him to state, for the record, the terms of his proposed spousal support. Robert adjusted his tie, a familiar gesture of self-importance, and leaned toward the microphone. His voice was clear, carrying across the silent courtroom. It was a voice I had heard for 20 years, often softened by what I once mistook for affection, now sharpened by contempt. Given that my wife has no marketable skills, no recent work history, and no independent means, he began, as if reading from a script he'd rehearsed in the mirror, I have proposed a generous transitional support, $3,000 a month for a period of 2 years. This should provide her ample time to secure basic employment and locate suitable housing. The air in the room was stale, filtered through an old ventilation system. I could smell the faint odor of lemon-scented polish on the wooden railing before me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my back straight against the hard bench. I did not look at him. I looked at my own hands, noticing the simple band I still wore, a placeholder for a life now concluded. "And what is your expectation for Mrs. Carter following this transitional period?" his lawyer prompted. Robert shifted in the witness chair. I could see the movement in my peripheral vision. "The expectation is that she will become self-sufficient. She is an intelligent woman. She can find clerical work, perhaps retail. With the alimony and a modest income, she can maintain a simple standard of living." There was a soft murmur from the gallery, a mix of pity and morbid fascination. We were a spectacle. The corporate vice president and his unskilled, aging wife. I felt the weight of their gazes, the unasked questions. How had she let this happen? Why did she have no career? His lawyer nodded, a performance of somber professionalism. "And have you and Mrs. Carter discussed this proposal?" "We have." Robert's tone changed, dropping into a confidential register that was meant to sound reasonable, but only sounded patronizing. "I've explained to Evelyn repeatedly that this is for her own good. The life we built was based on my income, my career. Without that foundation—" He paused, letting the implication hang. Then he did what I knew he would do. He turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes held no warmth, only a cold, glittering certainty. "Without it, she has nothing. I've told her, plainly, you're nothing without me. It's a hard truth, but a necessary one. She needs to understand that." He held my gaze, challenging me to react, to weep, to protest. The words, spoken so publicly in this sterile, official space, were meant to be the final nail, a legal and social confirmation of my irrelevance. I remembered him saying them first in our kitchen, his face flushed with anger during an argument about a bill I had questioned, then again whispered with false concern in our bedroom, suggesting I wouldn't manage the household accounts without him. Each time, a small erosion. In the courtroom, the silence was absolute. Even the judge, who had looked bored moments before, now watched with focused attention. The court reporter's fingers were still over her machine. "And what was her response to this assessment?" his lawyer asked. Robert turned back, a faint dismissive smile on his lips. "Denial, usually, or silence. But the reality remains. Once the support ends, she'll see. She'll be begging. If not on the streets, then certainly to me for more money. It's inevitable." The word begging echoed. It was a specific, cruel word chosen for its power to humiliate. It painted a picture of desperation he believed was my destiny. I felt a familiar cold sensation settle in my chest, not the heat of anger, but the solidity of ice. It was the same feeling I had when I first saw the text on his phone from his junior associate. The same feeling when I sat in Miriam Jones's office and told her everything. My lawyer, Miriam, was a still presence beside me. I could sense her coiled energy, her outrage held in check by formidable discipline. She did not stir or make a sound. She was waiting. Robert's lawyer concluded his questioning with a satisfied air. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge looked to Miriam. "Cross-examination, Ms. Jones." Miriam stood. She was an imposing figure in her dark suit, her posture radiating authority. "Thank you, Your Honor. Just a few questions." She picked up a notepad but did not glance at it. She walked toward the witness stand with a slow, deliberate pace. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice calm and clear, "this generous transitional support, it is based on your assertion that my client has no independent means. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Robert said, a note of impatience creeping in. "And your belief that she is nothing without you is the foundation of your entire position in this divorce settlement?" "It's not a belief. It's a fact. She has not worked outside the home in 18 years. She has no separate income, no significant assets in her name." Miriam nodded slowly, as if considering this. "So, your entire case rests on your assumption of her financial nullity." "It's not an assumption. It's based on the financial disclosures. Her accounts are negligible." "I see." Miriam stopped walking and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, given the gravity of the testimony we have just heard regarding my client's future prospects and well-being, and given the characterization of her person, I request a brief recess. I need to consult with my client on a point of law that has just become relevant." The judge studied Miriam for a moment, then looked at the clock. "Very well, we will reconvene in 15 minutes. The gavel cracked. The spell of quiet broke, replaced by the rustle of people standing, the low hum of conversation. Robert stood from the witness chair, his expression one of smug vindication. He caught my eye as he stepped down, his lips forming a tight, triumphant smile. He believed he had won. He believed he had just publicly dismantled me, and that the recess was a sign of my lawyer's desperation. I rose slowly, my movements controlled. Miriam placed a steadying hand on my elbow, a gesture that looked professional but was filled with silent communication. We turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. I could feel Robert's gaze on my back, could almost hear the narrative forming in his mind. The defeated wife, being led away by her lawyer to face the bleak future he had so eloquently described. But as I pushed through the doors into the echoing marble hallway, the cold feeling in my chest did not thaw into fear. It hardened into resolve. He had said his piece. He had laid his truth bare for the court. Now it was almost my turn. The 15-minute recess stretched before me, a final quiet interlude before the landscape of his world would be irrevocably altered. I did not look back. The hallway was cool and echoey, the sound of our heels on marble a sharp counterpoint to the muffled voices from other courtrooms. Miriam guided me to a quiet alcove near a window overlooking the city. She did not speak immediately. She looked at me, her dark eyes assessing, and then a slow, deliberate smile touched her lips. "He certainly gave us the opening," she said, her voice low. "He painted the picture exactly as we needed it. Arrogance makes people careless." I nodded, looking out the window. The city moved below, oblivious. "He believes every word he said." "Of course he does." Miriam leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "Men like him always do. Their world is built on those assumptions. It's what makes the collapse so satisfying." She paused. "Are you ready?" Her question wasn't about legal readiness. It was about the emotional precipice of exposing a secret I had carried for years. I thought of the first time I had kept a secret from Robert. It was not about money, not at first. It was about a piece of my mind I decided to keep for myself. 7 years ago, the days had a particular sameness. Chloe was 12, more independent, her world expanding beyond the walls of our home. Robert's career was accelerating, requiring more travel, more dinners where I was a decorative accessory. My role was defined: manage the household, appear at functions, provide a stable, quiet backdrop for his ambitions. I was good at it. I perfected the art of the listening smile, the thoughtful nod, but my own mind, which had once been sharp with academic curiosity, felt like a tool left to rust. The idea did not arrive as a lightning bolt. It accumulated. I had always been the one to research our major purchases, analyze investment reports Robert brought home, though he never asked for my opinion. I simply understood the language of numbers and strategy. It was a skill that went unacknowledged and unused. One afternoon, after organizing yet another charity gala for Robert's firm, I was clearing the dining table. Among the invoices and seating charts was a trade magazine left by one of his colleagues. An article detailed the struggles of small boutique retailers trying to establish an online presence. I read it. Then I read it again. The problems described were so clear to me, the logistical hurdles, the marketing missteps. I saw solutions with immediate, concrete clarity. That night, after Robert was asleep, I went to my desktop computer in the little alcove we called the study. I created a new email address. Not my name. Not anything connected to me. It was a bland, professional string of words. Then I found an online forum where small business owners discussed these very issues. I created a profile under the pseudonym Eve Charles. My first post was a response to a desperate question about inventory management for a handmade jewelry seller. I wrote a detailed, step-by-step plan. The next day, there was a reply. "Thank you. This is the most practical advice I've ever gotten." A private message followed asking if I consulted. My heart beat a steady, unfamiliar rhythm against my ribs. I quoted a fee, a number I pulled from the air, thinking it was audacious. The reply came, "Sold. How do we start?" That was how it began, not with a grand plan for rebellion, but with a simple exchange of knowledge for money, my first client. I conducted our meetings via email and phone calls. I told Robert I was on the phone with my sister, or a friend from my college days. The lie was small and sat in my stomach with a peculiar weight, but the weight of being paid for my own intelligence was heavier, and it anchored me. I needed a place to meet, away from the house. I chose a busy cafe downtown, one I never visited with Robert or his circle. The noise was a shield. I remember the first time I sat across from a client, a woman named Anya who made organic children's clothing. The clatter of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of a dozen conversations created a curtain of anonymity. I was not Evelyn Carter, vice president's wife. I was Eve Charles, consultant. Anya spread her ledgers across the small table. "I'm barely breaking even," she said, her voice tight with worry. "The website traffic is there, but they don't convert." I looked at her numbers, at her website on my laptop screen. The issues were obvious. Her product photography was amateurish. Her checkout process had too many steps. I spoke for 20 minutes outlining specific, actionable changes. I saw the tension leave her shoulders. She took frantic notes. "This makes sense," she kept saying. "This actually makes sense." At the end, she handed me an envelope with cash. I had instructed her to use a fictitious P.O. box I'd rented under the Eve Charles name. The envelope was not thick, but its significance was immense. I had created value, separate from my husband, separate from my role as a mother and hostess. The money was proof. I deposited the cash into a new bank account I opened at a different institution, one where Robert and I did not have joint accounts. The process required identification, but I used my real name. There was no law against a married woman having her own savings account. It felt illicit anyway. The teller was polite, indifferent. I walked out with a debit card and a checkbook that I would hide in the back of my filing cabinet, behind old tax returns. The work continued. Word of mouth among a certain network of small female entrepreneurs was a powerful thing. Eve Charles gained a reputation for clear, effective advice. My client list grew to 5, then 10. I kept meticulous records in a password-protected spreadsheet. I learned about invoicing, about basic business taxes for a sole proprietorship. I read books, took online courses at night. My secret life had its own structure, its own demands, its own rewards. Robert noticed nothing. Why would he? He was consumed with his own deals, his own ascendancy. Sometimes he would ask what I'd done all day. The usual, I would say. Errands, planning Chloe's school fundraiser. He would nod, already moving on to the next thing. My silence was not just about hiding money. It was about hiding a part of myself that he had never thought to look for, a part he was certain did not exist. Miriam's voice brought me back to the courthouse alcove. The recess is almost over. They'll be calling us back in. I turned from the window. The cold feeling in my chest had been replaced by the memory of that first envelope of cash, the smell of coffee and pastries in that busy cafe, the silent power of a secret growing in the dark. I'm ready, I said. And I was. Ready to show that the nothing he described had been, for years, quietly building something he could never comprehend. Miriam's question hung between us, a quiet challenge. I nodded once, a sharp, definitive motion. The memory of those early nervous days was replaced by a later, more solid certainty. The secret savings account had been a beginning, but it was still within reach, still tied to my name in a domestic system. The true separation, the one that would create an unbreachable wall, came later. 5 years ago, the Eve Charles consultancy was no longer a side project. It was a robust, if discreet, enterprise. I had a stable of 15 recurring clients and a waiting list. My domestic savings account had grown to a sum that made me uncomfortable keeping it in a standard bank. It was a 6-figure number, earned one invoice at a time. The money was a testament to my work, but it also represented a vulnerability. In a divorce, which even then I had begun to contemplate as a distant theoretical possibility, those records could be subpoenaed. The money would be seen as a marital asset, something to be divided. More importantly, it would reveal my enterprise, turning my private achievement into a point of legal negotiation. I could not allow that. One of my longest-standing clients was a woman named Delphine Laurent. She was in her 60s, a former financier who had retired to run a high-end antique brokerage online. She was sharp, perceptive, and valued my logistical mind. Over our quarterly strategy calls, a professional respect had deepened into a guarded mentorship. She never asked personal questions, but she listened to the careful neutrality of my tone, noted my refusal to schedule calls during what she termed domestic hours. During one call, I was reviewing her quarterly tax liabilities. I offered a strategy for reinvesting a portion of her profits into a more tax-efficient structure. She was silent for a moment. After I finished, "Eve," she said, her accent softening the vowel, "that is clever, very clever. You have a mind for this, not just for shopkeeping, but for the architecture of wealth." She paused. "Where do you park your own gains?" The question was casual, but its intent was not. It was a probe, an offer wrapped in inquiry. I was cautious. "In a standard savings vehicle. It's sufficient for now." "Sufficient is not secure," she replied. Her video background was, as always, a wall of books with a window overlooking a serene body of water, Lake Geneva, she had mentioned once in passing. For a woman, especially one with independent aspirations, sufficiency is a trap. Wealth must be protected before it can grow. It requires privacy. I said nothing, waiting. "I am not asking for confidences," she continued, reading my silence correctly. "I am stating a principle. If your endeavors continue to prosper, you will face a choice. You can leave your success exposed, or you can shelter it. There are institutions that understand discretion." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes clear on the screen. "My own bank in Zurich has a private client division. They ask no unnecessary questions. They provide numbers, not names. I can make an introduction if the time comes." The call ended with the usual business, but her words remained. Privacy, shelter, discretion. They were the missing pieces in my plan. I spent the next month researching. I read about Swiss banking laws, about asset protection, about the legalities of foreign accounts for U.S. citizens. I understood the reporting requirements. It was complex, but not inaccessible. It was a system, and I had learned how to navigate systems. The decision crystallized during a weekend when Robert was away on a golf trip. I sat at my desk, the house silent around me. I looked at the balance in my savings account. It was money that belonged to Eve Charles, a person who did not legally exist. To bring it fully to life, it needed a home he could never find. I emailed Delphine. "The time has come. I would appreciate that introduction." Her response was swift. A name, a contact email at the bank, and a single line. "Tell them Ms. Laurent sent you. They will understand." The process was conducted entirely online and through encrypted channels. I never spoke to anyone. I filled out digital forms. I provided scanned documentation that verified my identity as Evelyn Carter. But the account was structured in a way that separated the beneficial ownership from the day-to-day banking. It was a private numbered portfolio. My point of contact was a Mr. Adler, whose emails were models of impersonal efficiency. The day of the transfer arrived. I initiated the wire from my domestic bank to the Zurich account. The amount was substantial, nearly 80% of my total savings. I kept a buffer in the domestic account for operational expenses, for plausible deniability. The online banking portal asked for a final confirmation. I entered the password. A security token code was sent to my separate phone, the one Robert did not know existed. I typed it in. A dialog box appeared. Transfer submitted. There was no fanfare, no physical sensation. On my screen, the balance in my savings account dropped dramatically. In Zurich, a number in a computer server increased. That was all. But the finality of it was absolute. I had taken a part of myself, the part I had built in silence, and sent it beyond his reach, beyond the reach of any court he might imagine controlling. It was no longer just savings. It was capital. It was a fact that existed independently of my life as Evelyn Carter. From then on, a portion of every payment I received was routed directly to the Zurich account. The domestic account saw enough activity to seem legitimate. Modest deposits, small withdrawals for household items I would pay for in cash and squirrel away. But the engine of my wealth was elsewhere, growing quietly in the dark, fueled by my own effort and protected by a wall of Swiss discretion. The sound of the courtroom door opening broke my reverie. The bailiff stepped into the hallway. "Court is reconvening." Miriam looked at me, a final searching glance. "Remember," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "they are asking about the wife they think they know. You are about to introduce them to someone else." We walked back toward the door. The murmurs from inside grew louder as we approached. I thought of the confirmation screen, the transfer submitted. Today would be another kind of transfer, the movement of truth from the shadows into the stark light of the law. My hand did not shake as I reached for the door handle. The door swung shut behind us, sealing us back into the hush of the courtroom. The air felt heavier now, charged with an anticipation that hadn't been there before. Robert was already seated at his table, his posture relaxed, confident. He watched me take my seat beside Miriam with the faint, possessive smile of a man who believes he has already secured his prize. The judge addressed Miriam. "Ms. Jones, you may proceed with your cross-examination." Miriam stood, but instead of approaching the witness stand immediately, she turned slightly toward me, then back to the judge. "Your Honor, before I continue my examination of Mr. Carter, I would like to establish some context for his earlier statements regarding my client's capabilities and their marital dynamic. To do that, I need to revisit a specific event. With the court's permission, I will lead my client through a brief line of questioning to set the scene." "Proceed," the judge said, curiosity now evident in his expression. Miriam walked toward me, but her gaze was on the room. Mrs. Carter, I want you to think back to approximately 6 months ago. Did you and your husband host a dinner party at your home? Robert's lawyer was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? We're here to discuss financial support, not social calendars. The relevance will become clear, Miriam said calmly without looking at him. It goes directly to Mr. Carter's stated belief in my client's lack of acumen and the environment of disparagement. Overruled, the judge said. You may answer, Mrs. Carter. Yes, I said, my voice clear in the quiet room. We did. The memory surfaced with precise, painful clarity. It had been a dinner for Robert's most important client and his wife. I had spent 2 days planning the menu, coordinating with the caterer, ensuring the house was impeccable. I wore the emerald green dress Robert liked, the one he said complimented his suit. The conversation over dessert turned to the recent volatility in the tech market. The client, a man named David, was expressing concern about his portfolio. Robert launched into a generic reassurance about long-term holds. David nodded, not fully convinced. I had been following the trends for my own clients. A particular niche, cloud security for small businesses, was not just surviving but thriving due to the shift in work patterns. Without thinking, I leaned forward slightly. It might be less about broad exposure and more about targeted sectors, I said. The panic is in consumer tech, but the B2B infrastructure supporting remote work is seeing unprecedented investment. A pivot there could hedge the volatility. There was a moment of silence at the table. David looked at me, his eyes sharpening. That's a very specific and interesting point, Evelyn. Are you in the industry? Before I could open my mouth, Robert let out a hearty, dismissive chuckle. He reached over and patted my hand, then let his palm rest on top of it, a gesture that felt like a lid being clamped down. Don't let her fool you, he said, his tone warm and patronizing. She picks up bits and pieces from listening to me talk shop. She's got a good ear for the buzzwords, don't you, dear? He squeezed my hand, a silent command to acquiesce. The client's wife smiled a tight, understanding smile. David's interest faded, replaced by polite amusement. The conversation moved on. I sat there, the weight of Robert's hand on mine feeling like an anchor. The sting wasn't in the theft of the idea, it was in the reduction. I was not a person with insight. I was a parrot repeating phrases. It was a small public erasure. Later, after the guests had left and the caterers were cleaning, Robert poured himself a scotch. You shouldn't interject like that with David, he said, not looking at me. It confuses the conversation. Stick to the hosting. You excel at that. I did not reply. I carried a tray of used glasses into the kitchen. His phone was on the counter, charging. It buzzed, lighting up with a notification. I had no intention of looking. But as I passed, it buzzed again, and the screen stayed illuminated for a long moment. The sender's name was Jennifer H.R. The preview text was visible. Rob, thanks for tonight. You were brilliant as always. Can't stop thinking about that drink after the conference last week. We should... The text cut off. The screen went dark. I stood in the cool, stainless steel silence of the kitchen. The hum of the dishwasher was the only sound. I picked up a stray linen napkin from the counter and folded it. My movements automatic. I unfolded it and folded it again, creasing the edges with my thumbnail. I listened to the clink of his glass in the other room, the sound of his contentment. The two moments fused together. The patronizing touch on my hand, the glowing screen in the dark kitchen. They were not the same, but they were branches of the same tree. One dismissed my mind, the other betrayed my partnership. Both assumed my passivity, my blindness, my absolute dependence. That was the night the last thread of hope, the fragile belief that he might one day see me, finally snapped. The emotional calculus I had been performing for years reached its conclusion. The quiet, hidden life I had built was no longer a complement to my marriage. It was an escape route, and I was ready to use it. In the courtroom, Miriam's voice guided me back. And after that dinner party, Mrs. Carter, what was the state of your marriage? Robert's lawyer shouted. "Objection! Calls for a conclusion, invades marital privilege." The judge held up a hand. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer in general terms." I looked directly at Robert for the first time since my testimony began. He was staring at me, his earlier confidence replaced by a wary confusion. He remembered that night, I could see. He remembered patting my hand. "The state of my marriage," I said, my voice even, "was that I understood it was a fiction. I understood that my husband saw me as an accessory, not a partner. And I understood that I was done participating in the performance." A ripple went through the gallery. Robert's jaw tightened. Miriam gave a small, satisfied nod. "No further questions for now, Your Honor, but the context is now established." She returned to her seat. The judge called for a short break. As I stood, I felt the weight of Robert's stare, no longer smug but sharp with the first real flicker of alarm. He was beginning to sense that the dinner party had not been an isolated moment of his triumph, but the beginning of his undoing. The judge's call for a recess was a welcome punctuation. The gallery's murmurs swelled into conversation as people stood. Robert remained at his table, his head bent in low, urgent consultation with his lawyer. He did not look at me again. The flicker of alarm I had seen was now buried under a scowl of concentrated strategy. He was regrouping, recalibrating. He still believed the battle was over the terms of my surrender, not the reality of my arsenal. Miriam touched my elbow. "Let's step outside. We need to talk about the next phase." We walked back into the marble hallway, but instead of the alcove, she led me to a small, empty consultation room. The air inside was still and smelled of dust. She closed the door, and the noise of the hallway vanished. "You did perfectly," she said, sitting across from me at a plain wooden table. "He's off balance. He knows the doting, dim wife narrative has a crack in it. His team will now try to patch it by attacking your credibility, your stability. They'll paint your reaction as hysterical, bitter." She leaned forward, her hands clasped. "It's time to decide. We can continue to play defense, parrying their thrusts, or we can take the offensive. But to do that, I need to understand everything, not just the emotional landscape, the concrete one." She was asking for the final truth, the one I had only hinted at when I first walked into her sunlit office months ago. That first meeting with Miriam Jones had been the day after I hired a private investigator to confirm what the text message had suggested. The evidence was a series of photographs, mundane yet damning. Robert and Jennifer leaving a hotel together, not a conference in sight. I felt no fresh pain looking at them, only a cold, clean certainty. I needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I needed one who would see me, not just the wronged wife. I found Miriam through a discreet referral from an online network of professional women. Her reputation was for being fierce, thorough, and possessing a particular understanding for clients who needed more than just legal representation. They needed an ally. Her office was in a midtown building, unassuming but well kept. The room was filled with light from a large window. Law books lined one wall, but the space felt personal, not intimidating. Miriam herself was a tall, imposing woman with graying hair cut close to her head. She regarded me not with pity, but with a sharp, assessing intelligence. "Evelyn Carter," she said, gesturing to a chair, "tell me why you're here." I began with the facts: the length of the marriage, Robert's income, the discovery of the affair. I spoke in clear, unemotional sentences. She took notes, nodding. "This is straightforward, though unpleasant," she said. "Adultery can influence settlements in this state. We'll file, subpoena his financials, and seek an appropriate division of assets and support. Is there anything else? Any other marital assets, debts I should know about?" I took a breath. This was the moment. "There is something else, but it isn't a marital asset, not really." She put her pen down. "Explain." "For the past 7 years," I began, my voice steady, "I have run a successful business consulting firm, e-commerce strategy for small retailers. I operate under a pseudonym. My clients pay me into accounts my husband knows nothing about." Miriam's expression did not change, but her eyes grew more focused. "Go on." "I started with a domestic savings account. Then about 5 years ago, on the advice of a client, I established a private banking relationship in Zurich. The majority of my earnings are held there. The domestic account has enough to appear legitimate if scrutinized, but it's a decoy." "What is the scale?" she asked, her tone purely professional. "The Zurich portfolio," I said, stating the figure for the first time aloud to another person, "is currently valued at just over $4 million. The room was silent. A beam of sunlight cut across the desk between us, highlighting motes of dust in the air. Miriam did not blink. A slow, profound smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of greed or surprise, but of deep, incredulous satisfaction. It was the smile of a strategist who has just been handed the keys to the enemy's fortress. "4 million," she repeated softly, "and Robert Carter believes you are destitute. He believes I am nothing without him." Those were his words. Miriam leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said, almost to herself. Then she looked at me, her gaze electric. "Evelyn, what do you want? A fair division of the marital property? Or do you want something more?" I met her eyes. "I want him to know. I want him to understand in a way he cannot ignore or dismiss exactly what he has underestimated. I want the legal victory, but I want the truth to be the weapon." Miriam nodded, the smile settling into a look of fierce resolve. "Then we do not disclose this, not yet. We let him file for divorce on the grounds of irretrievable breakdown. We let his lawyers, in their arrogance, demand full financial disclosure from you, expecting to find empty pockets. We provide the domestic records. We play the part of the vulnerable spouse, concerned about her future. We let him commit, absolutely, to the narrative of your dependence." She tapped a finger on the desk. "And then, at the precise moment when he has staked his entire position on your nothingness, we introduce the Zurich accounts into evidence, not as a marital asset to be divided, but as proof of your independent capability. It renders his argument for alimony null. It humiliates him. It changes everything." It was the first time I had felt a sense of collaboration, of shared purpose. "You think we can do that?" "I know we can," she said. "The law requires disclosure of assets relevant to support. We will disclose them at the strategically correct time. This isn't just about divorce, Evelyn. This is about correction. And I am very, very good at corrections." In the dusty consultation room, Miriam watched me, waiting. The memory of that first meeting, of her delighted resolve, solidified my own. "The concrete landscape is unchanged, Miriam," I said. "Zurich is waiting." Her eyes gleamed. "Good. Then when we go back in, we continue the performance. Let him think the crack is all there is, the dinner party, the hurt feelings. Let him believe that's the extent of our ammunition." She stood, smoothing her suit jacket. "The foundation is poured. Now we let him walk onto it, believing it's solid ground." We left the room. The hallway was clearing as people moved back toward the courtroom doors. I saw Robert ahead, holding the door for his lawyer, his posture once again one of controlled authority. He had patched his confidence, convinced himself my testimony was a minor emotional outburst. He was walking back into the room, ready to resume his story. He had no idea our story was just beginning. The judge's return to the bench silenced the room. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Robert's lawyer, a man named Stephen Gable, whose suits were always a shade too expensive. "Mr. Gable, you indicated before the recess you wished to address a procedural matter." Gable stood, oozing a professional concern that masked his condescension. "Thank you, Your Honor. Given the emotional turn of Mrs. Carter's testimony and the clear financial disparity between the parties, we believe it is imperative to move forward with full financial discovery. To date, we've received only partial documentation from Mrs. Carter. We request an order for the immediate and complete disclosure of all her financial accounts, records, and any sources of income, however modest. We cannot properly address the issue of spousal support without a clear picture of her true financial position. He said modest with a slight dismissive inflection. He was performing for his client, reinforcing the narrative. I watched Robert nod slowly, a grave expression on his face, as if this were a necessary but tedious step in the management of a minor problem. Miriam stood. Your Honor, we have no objection to full and complete disclosure as required by law. We have been in the process of compiling these documents and will provide them promptly. The judge nodded. So ordered. Provide the documents to Mr. Gable within 7 days. We will reconvene for a hearing on the support motion once discovery is complete. He brought the gavel down. The formal session was over. The strategic one, however, had concluded months earlier in a bland conference room in Gable's own law firm. The discovery meeting had taken place 8 weeks after the divorce papers were served. Miriam had instructed me not to attend. This is a play. I know my lines. You stay off stage. She went alone carrying a simple legal-sized folder. She had described the scene to me afterward with clinical precision. The conference room was all glass and bleached wood, with a view of the city that was meant to impress. Stephen Gable was there with a junior associate. Robert was not present. This was a matter for the professionals to handle, beneath his direct involvement. Miriam said Gable greeted her with a patronizing warmth. Miriam, good to see you. I hope we can move this along efficiently. My client is keen to resolve this and provide Mrs. Carter with the stability she needs. As is mine, Miriam replied, taking a seat. She placed her folder on the table. Gable gestured to his associate, who slid a thick stack of papers across the table. Our client's complete financial disclosure. As you'll see, his income is substantial, but his liabilities are also significant. The lifestyle was supported by cash flow, not vast reserves. We've highlighted the proposed support calculations. Miriam accepted the stack without looking at it. Thank you. She then slid her own, much thinner folder across the table. My client's financial disclosure. Gable took it, unable to hide a flicker of satisfaction at its slenderness. He opened it. Inside were statements from 2 accounts. The domestic savings account I used as a decoy, showing a balance of approximately $45,000, and a basic checking account with a few thousand for household operations. There were also the legally required tax returns, which showed my reported income as 0. There was a single, legitimate 1099 form from a small online platform where I had done a tiny amount of freelance editing years prior, included for the sake of thoroughness. It reported earnings of $1,200. He flipped through the pages, his expression one of confirmed expectation. He looked up at Miriam, his face a mask of somber understanding. I see. This aligns with our understanding. It's a challenging position for Mrs. Carter to be in after so many years out of the workforce. It is a position, Miriam said, her tone neutral. We will, of course, need statements for the full 3-year look-back period for these accounts, Gable said, pushing the folder toward his associate for copying. They are all there, Miriam replied. You'll see the activity is consistent. Modest deposits from what appears to be the sale of personal items, small withdrawals for personal expenses. Gable leaned back in his chair. It's a pity. With no employable skills and no assets, her future is precarious. I hope she's being realistic in her expectations. My client is entirely realistic, Miriam said, gathering her copy of Robert's documents. She understands the situation completely. The meeting concluded with perfunctory talk of scheduling. As Miriam stood to leave, Gable offered one final, almost paternalistic remark. Tell Mrs. Carter we're not monsters. We want a fair outcome. but fair has to be based on facts, and the facts are what they are. Miriam had recounted this to me, her voice dry. He was so pleased with himself, Evelyn. He looked at that thin folder and saw his entire case validated. He saw a woman with a pathetic $45,000 to her name, facing the abyss. He never thought to question why I was so calm. Back in the present courtroom, people were dispersing. Gable was shaking Robert's hand, speaking in low, congratulatory tones. They had gotten their order. They believed the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Robert's eyes met mine across the room. He didn't smile this time, but there was a settled assurance in his gaze. He had heard the order for disclosure. He believed that in 7 days Miriam would hand over a folder that contained, at best, proof of my pathetic little secret savings. It would be the final nail. He gave me a slow, almost pitying nod before turning away. Miriam was packing her briefcase beside me. "The trap is sprung," she said quietly without looking up. "They've taken the bait. Now we wait for them to chew on it." We walked out of the courtroom. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the hallway. I thought of that thin folder in Gable's conference room, the $45,000 that had confirmed every one of his assumptions. It was the most expensive decoy I had ever created. Its purpose was not to hide wealth, but to reveal a truth far more valuable, their utter complacent blindness. The real documents, the ones that mattered, were not in that building. They were in a vault in Zurich, waiting, and in 7 days we would not be providing them. We would be unleashing them. The heavy door of the courtroom clicked shut behind us, muting the residual sounds of the proceeding. We stood for a moment in the wide, echoing hallway. The 7-day deadline for disclosure now hung in the air, a ticking clock only Miriam and I understood the true meaning of. We began walking toward the bank of elevators at the end of the corridor. Our footsteps were sharp and solitary on the polished marble. We were halfway there when I heard his steps accelerating behind us, a purposeful, familiar stride. "Evelyn, Miriam." I turned. Robert had broken away from a conversation with Stephen Gable and now stood before us, his overcoat draped over one arm. The assured public mask was back in place, but his eyes held a glint of private triumph. Gable lingered a respectful distance away, pretending to examine his phone. "That was a necessary bit of business," Robert said, his voice pitched low, confidential. "The judge saw reason. Full transparency is always best." He was speaking to me, but his gaze flickered toward Miriam, assessing her reaction. "It is the law," Miriam replied, her tone flat. "Of course." Robert's attention settled back on me. The patronizing warmth he used at cocktail parties crept into his voice. "I know this is difficult for you to grasp, all these legal maneuvers, but this order, it's for the best. It ends the speculation. It means we can finally have a realistic conversation about your future, based on the actual numbers." He paused, letting the implication sink in. No more fantasies. I looked at him. I studied the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the absolute certainty in his eyes. He was waiting for my fear, my anxiety, my pleading. He was braced for an emotional reaction he could dismiss as hysterical, so I gave him none. Instead, I let my features relax into a small, serene smile. It was not broad. It did not reach my eyes with any warmth. It was simply an acknowledgement of his presence and his statement, an empty curve of the lips that conveyed nothing he could use. I held his gaze and said nothing. The effect was immediate. His confident posture stiffened. The glint in his eyes flickered, replaced by a faint confusion. He had prepared for an argument, for tears, for a scene. He was not prepared for a wall of calm. "The disclosure will make things clear," he continued, a hint of defensiveness entering his tone. "Once your financial picture is established, we can talk about a reasonable settlement. The offer I made still stands. It's generous given the circumstances." My smile remained unchanged. I offered a slight neutral nod. He shifted his weight, his grip tightening on his coat. "This isn't a game, Evelyn. This is your life. You'll be left with nothing. Don't you understand that? You're nothing without the life I provided." He said the words again, but this time they sounded less like a verdict and more like an incantation, as if repeating them could make my reaction conform to his script. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of the building. I watched as the confusion in his eyes deepened into a spark of irritation. My composure was a dissonant note in the narrative he had constructed, and it was grating on him. "Do you have anything to say?" he finally asked, his voice tighter. "I believe the court has outlined the next steps," I said, my voice even and quiet. "We will comply with the order." It was the most anodyne statement possible. It gave him nothing. It frustrated him utterly. His jaw worked slightly. He looked from my placid face to Miriam's expressionless one, seeking an ally or an explanation, and finding neither. "7 days," he said, the words coming out as a challenge. "7 days," I echoed, my tone merely factual. He stared at me for another long moment, searching for a crack, a tremor, a sign that the facade was about to crumble. He found only the smooth, impenetrable surface of my calm. The confidence that had propelled him across the hallway seemed to deflate, just a fraction. He gave a short, sharp nod, more to himself than to us, then turned on his heel and walked back to Gable. Miriam and I continued to the elevators. She pressed the button. "He's unsettled," she murmured, watching their retreating figures. "He doesn't know why," I said. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. We stepped inside the empty car. As the doors slid shut, I caught a final glimpse of Robert. He was not talking to Gable. He was staring at the closed elevator doors, his forehead creased in a frown, his earlier triumph completely evaporated. He was a man who had just thrown a stone at a shadow and heard no sound of impact, left to wonder if he had hit anything at all. The descent was smooth and silent. Miriam did not speak. There was no need. The encounter had been a perfect miniature execution of our strategy. We had not fought him. We had not argued. We had simply reflected his own aggression back at him as a void, and in that void his certainty had begun to echo strangely. He had expected to face a begging woman. He had found instead a woman at peace. And for a man whose entire worldview relied on being the essential, dominant force, my peace was the most terrifying and inexplicable thing he could imagine. It was the first real crack, hairline but deep, in the marble facade of his arrogance. He would spend the next 7 days trying to diagnose it, to explain it away. He would never suspect that the source of my calm was not resignation, but the quiet hum of a fortune he knew nothing about, waiting in a vault thousands of miles away, poised to turn his entire world to dust. The 7 days passed with the silent, inexorable quality of a sealed countdown. I complied with the court's order. Miriam submitted the additional statements for my domestic accounts, providing the full 3-year look-back as requested. The transaction history showed the same modest, unremarkable pattern. Small deposits categorized as personal sales, withdrawals for groceries, gas, the occasional haircut. It was the financial fingerprint of a careful, limited life. Robert's team would have pored over them, finding nothing to contradict their thesis. Their confidence, I knew, would be absolute. Now we were back in the same courtroom, the same players arranged on the same stage. The air was different, though. It was charged with a procedural finality. This was the hearing on the motion for spousal support, the culmination of Robert's narrative. He sat at his table, his posture erect, his attention fixed on the judge. He looked like a man awaiting a verdict he had already written himself. The judge reviewed some papers, then looked up. "We are here to address the petitioner's motion for temporary and permanent spousal support. Mr. Gable, you may proceed." Gable stood, his manner sober and persuasive. "Thank you, Your Honor. As the court is aware, we have now received full financial disclosure from the respondent. The picture it paints is unambiguous." He held up a copy of the statement package Miriam had provided. The respondent has no meaningful income, no significant assets, and no recent employment history. She is entirely dependent. My client, Mr. Carter, has been the sole financial provider for this family for 2 decades. His willingness to support his wife during this transition is evident in his generous offer. We ask the court to formalize this support, ensuring Mrs. Carter has the means to secure housing and basic necessities, while also setting a clear path toward the eventual termination of that support as she, hopefully, gains a foothold in the workforce. He spoke of me as one would speak of a minor or an invalid. It was dehumanizing in its clinical politeness. "Ms. Jones?" the judge said, turning to Miriam. Miriam rose. "Thank you, Your Honor. I have a few questions for my client that I believe are essential to the court's consideration of this motion. I request she be called to the stand." The judge nodded. "Mrs. Carter, please take the stand." I stood and walked the short distance to the witness chair. The wood was smooth and cool under my palms as I sat. I adjusted the microphone, my movements deliberate. I could feel Robert's gaze, heavy and expectant. He was waiting for the performance of neediness he believed must come. Miriam approached, her demeanor calm and methodical. "Mrs. Carter, you have heard your husband's attorney state that you have no means of supporting yourself. Is that your understanding?" "No, it is not," I said, my voice clear. A faint ripple of interest passed through the room. Robert's eyebrows drew together slightly. "Could you elaborate?" Miriam asked. "I have heard my husband say I am nothing without him. I have heard his attorney say I have no resources. That is their opinion. It is not a fact about my capabilities." Gable shifted in his seat, but did not object. This was still within the bounds of subjective belief. Miriam continued. "During your marriage, did you at any point have access to independent funds? Funds not provided by your husband?" "Yes, I did." "And did you have a means of generating income separate from your husband's employment?" "Yes, I did." Robert was now sitting perfectly still, his eyes narrowed. Gable leaned over and whispered something to him, a reassurance. This was just talk they would be thinking, unsubstantiated claims. "Your Honor," Miriam said, turning to the judge, "the petitioner's entire case rests on the assertion of my client's financial nullity. He has stated under oath that she would be begging. We have now established that my client contests that assertion and claims she had independent means. To resolve this central material dispute, I seek to admit a new set of documents into evidence." She walked to our table and picked up a thick, legal-sized folder. It was sealed with a heavy-duty clasp. She carried it to the clerk's desk. "This folder contains financial records previously undisclosed because they were not, in our view, marital assets subject to division. However, given the petitioner's sworn testimony regarding my client's destitution, they become directly relevant to the issue of support. They prove the existence and scale of her independent financial capacity." Gable was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant attempt to introduce new evidence at the 11th hour without proper discovery. We received their disclosure. This was not in it. This is prejudicial and improper." The judge held up a hand, his eyes on the sealed folder. "Ms. Jones, why were these documents not included in the respondent's mandatory financial disclosure?" Miriam faced him, unflinching. "Because the law requires disclosure of assets relevant to the division of marital property and determination of support. These assets are not marital property. They were generated independently by my client through her own skill and effort and held separately throughout the marriage. They are hers alone. Their relevance to support only became acute when the petitioner took the stand and swore to this court that she had nothing. He made her financial incapacity the cornerstone of his claim. We are now providing evidence that the cornerstone is false." The judge was silent for a long moment, considering. Robert was staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake on the clerk's desk. His face had lost some of its color. The absolute certainty was leaking away, replaced by a dawning, chilling suspicion. "The objection is overruled," the judge said finally. "The court will accept the folder as Exhibit A for identification purposes. We will examine its contents now. Ms. Jones, you may proceed to question your client about these documents." Gable sat down heavily. Robert did not move. Miriam turned back to me. Her eyes held a steady, triumphant light. "Mrs. Carter, I am now showing you what has been marked as Exhibit A." The clerk brought the folder to me. I opened the clasp. Inside were the first few pages, the cover letter from the private bank in Zurich and the first summary statement. I placed them on the ledge of the witness stand. "Do you recognize these documents?" Miriam asked. "Yes, I do." "What are they?" I looked up, not at Miriam, not at the judge, but directly at Robert. "These are the records of my private investment portfolio, held at a bank in Zurich, Switzerland. This is the money I earned myself." The words hung in the air, clean and precise. The money I earned myself. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the gallery, followed by a rustle of movement as people strained to see. The judge leaned forward, his expression no longer bored, but intensely focused. Robert remained motionless, his face ashen. Miriam approached the witness stand. "Let's establish the timeline, Mrs. Carter. When did you open this account?" 5 years and 4 months ago." "And the source of the funds?" "My business income. I ran an e-commerce consulting firm under the pseudonym Eve Charles. I provided strategic services to small and medium-sized retailers. All clients were acquired and served independently, without the use of any marital resources or contacts." "Objection!" Gable's voice was strained. "Foundation! This is a complete fabrication designed to—" "The witness is testifying to facts within her personal knowledge, Your Honor," Miriam interjected calmly. "She can be cross-examined on them." "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Jones." Miriam handed me another document from the folder. "Is this the initial wire transfer confirmation?" I looked at it. "Yes. It shows the transfer from my domestic business account to the new custodial account in Zurich. The amount was $320,000. A murmur broke out. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Silence. Robert flinched at the number. It was a sum that contradicted his narrative of my weekly allowance for household expenses. "And subsequent to that initial transfer, did you continue to fund this account?" Miriam asked. "I did. A minimum of 60% of my gross business income was transferred quarterly. The funds were managed by the bank's investment team according to my risk parameters." Miriam then picked up the final document, a consolidated statement dated 2 weeks prior. She showed it to me, then to the judge, and finally handed a copy to the clerk for delivery to Gable. "Mrs. Carter, can you read for the court the current total value of the portfolio as indicated on this statement?" I looked down at the number I had reviewed 100 times, the figure that represented 20 years of silent labor and 7 years of concentrated success. My voice did not waver. $4,218,756.41. The gasp this time was audible, uncontrollable. The judge did not call for order. He was staring at the paper the clerk had placed before him. Robert made a sound, a choked, guttural noise in the back of his throat. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Miriam let the number resonate in the stunned silence. Then she pressed on. "For comparison, Mrs. Carter, are you aware of your husband's total net worth, including all marital assets?" "I have seen his financial disclosures. The total net worth of the marital estate, as he reported it, is approximately $2,800,000, most of which is tied to equity in our home and his retirement accounts, which have significant early withdrawal penalties." "So, to be clear," Miriam said, turning to address the room as much as the judge. Your independently held assets, earned and accrued secretly during the marriage, exceed the total value of the entire marital estate accumulated through your husband's salary. Yes, they do. The arithmetic was brutal and incontrovertible. The nothing he had described was worth half again more than everything he owned. Robert suddenly pushed his chair back, the legs screeching on the floor. "This is a lie!" His voice was a raw, unfamiliar crack. "A setup. She couldn't. This is impossible." He was looking at his lawyer, at the judge, his eyes wide with panic and denial. Gable was frantically scanning the document, his face pale. "Your Honor, I move to have these documents examined by a forensic accountant. This could be fraud, forgery." "Mr. Gable," the judge's voice cut through, stern and measured, "you have just been handed what appears to be a complete, notarized record from one of the most reputable private banks in the world, detailing half a decade of activity. Your client testified under oath that his wife was destitute. He staked his case on it. You are in no position to cry foul about evidence that directly rebuts that testimony." The judge turned his gaze to me. "Mrs. Carter, you stated you earned this through a business. Did your husband have any knowledge of this enterprise?" "None, Your Honor. I operated under a pseudonym. All client communication, invoicing, and banking was separate. He believed I was occupied with homemaking and social engagements." "And why did you choose to keep this secret?" I looked directly at Robert. He was sinking back into his chair, his defiance crumbling into a state of shock. "Because early in our marriage, I expressed an interest in pursuing a career. I was told it was unnecessary, that my role was to support his career, that my ambitions were a distraction, my ideas were dismissed, my intelligence was treated as a hobby. I learned that, to have something of my own, I would have to keep it to myself. The secret was not for protection from the law, it was for protection from his disregard." The courtroom was utterly silent. The truth, now spoken, was not explosive. It was heavy, settling over the room like a pall. Miriam walked to the bench and placed another document before the judge. "Your Honor, this is a signed affidavit from the managing director of the Zurich Bank, confirming Mrs. Carter's identity as the sole beneficial owner of the portfolio, its legitimacy, and its existence free of any marital claims. We also have, for the court's review, a sampling of client contracts and redacted correspondence under the pseudonym Eve Charles, establishing the provenance of the income." The judge took the affidavit, reading it carefully. He then looked at Robert, who seemed to have shrunk in his seat. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone cold, "your attorney may wish to cross-examine, but I suggest you confer. Given this evidence, your motion for spousal support appears to be based on a fundamental misapprehension of fact, a misapprehension you, yourself, swore to under oath." Gable placed a hand on Robert's arm, whispering urgently. Robert shook his head, not in refusal, but in a dazed, disbelieving motion. He was staring at me, but he was no longer seeing the wife he thought he knew. He was seeing a stranger, a woman who had lived a parallel life in the shadow of his own, a life that had quietly surpassed it in every material way. The humiliation was not just public, it was ontological. He had not been defeated by a better lawyer or a trick of law. He had been defeated by the person he was most certain did not exist. Miriam returned to her seat beside me. She did not smile. She simply gave me a slight, firm nod. The revelation was complete. The folder had been opened. Every assumption, every condescending word, every patronizing touch had just been tallied against a balance sheet he could never have imagined. The begging he had prophesied would never come. The only thing left in that courtroom was the echoing silence of his own obliterated certainty. The silence that followed my testimony was thick, almost viscous. It was broken only by the rustle of paper as the judge finished reading the affidavit from Zurich. He placed it down carefully, aligning its edges with the other documents. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose for a moment, a small human gesture of processing. Then he replaced his glasses and looked at Stephen Gable. "Mr. Gable, does your client wish to cross-examine Mrs. Carter on these documents, on the origins of these funds, or the legitimacy of the bank's certification?" Gable stood, but his usual vigor was gone. He looked at Robert, who gave a barely perceptible, dazed shake of his head. Robert was staring at the surface of the table, his breathing shallow. "No cross-examination at this time, Your Honor," Gable said, his voice subdued. "We reserve the right to have our own experts review the materials." "Of course, you may do so." The judge's tone made it clear he considered that a pointless formality. He then turned his attention to Robert. "Mr. Carter, I need you to listen to me carefully." Robert's head lifted slowly, his eyes unfocused. "You testified before this court," the judge continued, his words measured and deliberate, "that your wife was nothing without you. You stated she would be begging. You predicated your entire application for spousal support on her complete financial dependency. You swore to this." The judge picked up the Zurich summary statement. "This evidence, which I find credible and compelling, demonstrates that your wife not only possessed significant independent means during the marriage, but that those means substantially exceed the total value of the marital estate you presented. Her separate property is not subject to division. More critically, it completely negates the foundational premise of your claim for support." He set the paper down and leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Robert. "The purpose of spousal support is to prevent a dependent spouse from falling into destitution following a divorce. It is not a reward. It is not an entitlement. It is a necessity. Based on the evidence before me, Mrs. Carter is demonstrably not destitute. She is, in fact, a woman of considerable independent wealth. Therefore, her petition for spousal support is moot, denied." A final soft sigh moved through the gallery. It was the sound of a conclusion being witnessed. The judge was not finished. "Furthermore, regarding the division of marital property, given the circumstances of this case, including the conduct of the marriage as described and the significant independent resources of one party, the court will equitably divide the marital assets with consideration for these factors. The marital home, given its size and expense, is to be sold. The net proceeds, after the settlement of the joint mortgage, will be allocated 70% to Mrs. Carter, 30% to Mr. Carter. His retirement accounts, accrued during the marriage, shall be divided with a 65% share to Mrs. Carter, 35% to Mr. Carter, via a qualified domestic relations order." It was a favorable split, reflecting the judge's clear disapproval of Robert's conduct and his perjury on the stand. Robert's financial empire, the one he believed was his sole creation and fortress, was being dismantled, and a larger portion was being handed to the person he deemed a beggar. The judge looked at Robert one last time. His voice, while not raised, carried a definitive, crushing weight. "Mr. Carter, you came before this court seeking a judgment based on a fiction of your own creation. The evidence has proven that fiction false. It appears your wife is not only something without you, she is quite everything without you. This matter is concluded." He brought the gavel down. The sound was crisp, absolute. Robert did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then his body seemed to lose all structural integrity. He did not slump gracefully. He collapsed backward into his chair, as if the bones had been removed from his spine, his head lolling slightly. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving a grayish pallor. He looked like a man who had been physically eviscerated. Stephen Gable placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking urgently into his ear, but Robert gave no sign of hearing him. He was staring into the middle distance, into the void of his own unraveled life. Miriam touched my arm. "Let's go." We stood. I did not look back at him. There was nothing more to see. We walked out of the courtroom through the heavy doors and into the bustling hallway. The noise of the outside world felt jarring, normal. And there, leaning against the opposite wall, was my daughter, Chloe. She was 19, tall and observant, her expression a mix of anxiety and fierce hope. When she saw my face, she pushed herself forward and wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick. I heard. People were talking in the hall. Is it true? I held her, feeling the solid reality of her. "It's true," I said. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine. "All of it? The business, the money?" "All of it." A tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling, a wide, relieved, proud smile. "I always knew," she said, her voice trembling. "I always knew you were more. I just didn't know how much more." Miriam stood beside us, a satisfied, quiet strength emanating from her. She extended her hand and I took it, not a handshake, but a firm, sustained clasp. "It is done," she said, and it was my profound professional privilege. We stood there for a moment, a small triad in the marble hallway, the mother, the daughter, the ally. The sounds of the courthouse swirled around us, but we existed in a pocket of hard-won peace. Later, after the paperwork had been initiated and the instructions given, I stood alone by the large window at the end of the corridor. I looked down at the city, at the streets I would now walk as a different person. The cold, calculating focus that had sustained me for months began to soften at the edges, not into euphoria, but into a profound and quiet certainty. The life I had built in secret was no longer a hidden annex. It was the main house. The offshore accounts were not a weapon anymore. They were a foundation. Robert's words, "You're nothing without me," echoed not as a curse, but as the ignorant pronouncement of a man who had never truly looked at the woman beside him. He was wrong. I had been everything, all along. I had just been waiting for the moment to step into the light and claim it. And now I had.